In the drizzle of Ancoats, Manchester, a single mother is told she's wasted her life guarding a husk of brick and rust, while polished men in warm cars count profits. This is a story of dignity under pressure and a door that opens when no one is looking. Stay with me, subscribe, like the video, and tell us where you're watching from. The morning smelled of damp cotton and machine oil, the kind that clings to skin long after you leave. Inside the old red brick factory on Jersey Street, Nora Bennett ran her fingers over a row of sleeping sewing machines, cool as river stones in winter. The early light filtered through high windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor where generations of women had stood their ground. A door banged open, the sound echoing through the cavernous space. Two figures stepped in, a council officer with a clipboard, Miss Rowe, and a developer in a sharp navy coat, Edward Langford. His shoes clicked like coins dropping on the concrete, each step precise and deliberate. "You've had months, Miss Bennett," Miss Rowe said, her voice thin and official. She taped a notice to the flaking green door. "Vacate. Redevelopment pending." Edward surveyed the place with the faint smile of a man looking at a bad painting he planned to paint over. From the pavement outside, a couple of passers-by peered in, curious at the official visit. The vinegar tang from the chippy on the corner gusted through the open door, mingling with the musty factory air. Someone snickered, loud enough to be heard. "You threw it all away, love." "Should have sold when you had the chance." Nora swallowed hard, a lump forming in her throat. The factory felt colder than the drizzle outside, the high windows sweating condensation like tears. On the far wall hung her mother's old clock, slow by 5 minutes, as if stalling for her. It had hung there since before Nora could remember, witnessing decades of women's labor. Behind Nora, a kettle began to whistle in the tiny kitchenette. She moved quickly to switch it off before it sang its full song. The silence that followed felt heavy, accusing. "This place kept women fed through strikes and winters," she said, barely above a whisper, her voice catching on the words. 3 generations of families found work here when nowhere else would take them. Edward stepped closer, inspecting the cracked tiles and the rolls of unused calico stacked neatly against the wall. His cologne smelled expensive, out of place among the honest scents of the workshop. "Nostalgia is expensive," he said, as if explaining weather to a child. "My investors don't pay for stories. They pay for square footage and return on investment." He glanced at his watch, a flash of gold against his wrist. "The market has spoken, Miss Bennett. This area is changing." The notice crackled under Ms. Rowe's firm palm as she smoothed it one final time. Nora felt the burn in her chest, something between shame and rage that she couldn't afford to show. Outside, a bus wheezed past, brakes squealing like an old loom straining under tension. For a heartbeat, the room held a heavy, breathless silence, thick with oil, steam, and a humiliation that tasted of iron. "You have 30 days, Miss Rowe added, softer now, almost apologetic. "I can provide information about available business relocation grants if you'd like." Nora nodded mechanically, but the words washed over her like rain on glass. When they left, the door closed with a finality that echoed through the space. Alone again, she approached the notice, her fingertips tracing the official letterhead, the formal language of displacement. She made tea with hands that trembled slightly, the familiar ritual grounding her. The mug warmed her palms as she walked the length of the workshop. Each machine had a name given by the women who had operated them through the years. Bertha, the oldest singer with her ornate gold decals worn to a whisper. Matilda, the overlocker that growled like a contented cat when running smoothly. The rain picked up outside, drumming against the skylight. Nora sat on her stool, tea cooling beside her, and pulled a half-finished dress from a nearby work basket. The fabric was soft blue cotton, the color of forget-me-nots. Mrs. Patel from the newsagents had brought it in for her granddaughter's graduation. "Only you can make it right," she'd said, pressing the bundle into Nora's hands. Nora threaded a needle, the familiar motion as automatic as breathing. The first stitch pulled the fabric together, a small act of creation in the face of ending. By the third stitch, tears blurred her vision. By the 10th, they fell silently onto the cloth, dark spots blooming on the blue like tiny storms. The factory had been her anchor when everything else had drifted. When Jamie's father disappeared before the boy's first birthday, when the bills mounted like snow against a door, when her mother Maureen passed, leaving Nora alone with a 7-year-old son and a building full of ghosts and possibilities. She wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, leaving a smudge of machine oil across her face. The clock ticked doggedly onward, 5 minutes behind the world outside, as if offering her just a little more time in this place that had sheltered so many dreams. The sound of a football thudding against the back wall broke her reverie. Jamie had arrived, letting himself in through the side door as he did every day after school. At 14, he was all elbows and knees, growing too fast for his uniform trousers, which now hovered above his ankles. "Mum," he called, spotting her hunched figure at the workbench. "You all right?" His footsteps quickened as he approached, the ball tucked under one arm. He smelled of playground dust and the chocolate bar he'd probably had for lunch, instead of the sandwich she'd made. "They've done it then," he said, noticing the notice on the door. His voice broke slightly, caught between childhood and something older. The suits. Nora straightened her back, wiping her eyes once more. Jamie didn't need to see her collapse. "Yes, love. They've done it." He dropped the ball, which rolled across the uneven floor before coming to rest against a cabinet of threads organized by color, a rainbow of possibilities now facing extinction. "But they can't," he insisted, the righteous indignation of youth coloring his cheeks. "This is our place. It's important." Nora reached for his hand, the skin still soft despite the calluses forming from his football practice. "Important things end too, Jamie. That's just the way of things." But even as she said it, something in her refused to believe it. The factory breathed around them, holding decades of women's work in its walls, their conversations and triumphs, their struggles and solidarity. Surely that meant something in a world that moved too fast, that tore down before understanding what it was losing. Nora had grown up with steam in her lungs and lint in her hair. Her earliest memories were of crawling beneath these same tables, making dolls from scraps while her mother, Maureen, stitched wedding dresses with nimble fingers. Maureen would sing Caledonia off-key while the kettle puffed Little Ghost in the cold air, her Scottish accent thickening when she hit the chorus. The workshop had been different then, busier, full of women's voices calling over the whir of machines, sharing stories of children's fevers and husbands' moods, of dreams deferred and small victories savored. They passed around thermoses of tea and homemade biscuits, their fingers quick even as they laughed. When Nora became a mother herself, Jamie in her arms, the father gone before the boy's first tooth, she came back to the factory because it was the only place where she knew exactly who she was. The building welcomed her back with familiar creaks and smells, with light that fell the same way across the cutting table, with the echo of her mother's voice in every corner. "The trick," Maureen had told her once, pinning a hem with her mouth full of pins, "is to keep something of yourself tucked away where the world can't see it. A little strength saved for when you need it most." Nora kept a dented biscuit tin on the shelf, smelling faintly of old sugar and lavender. Inside lay a cracked blue measuring tape. The numbers faded to a whisper. It had been her mother's, a ribbon of faith passed down the day Maureen told her, "When fabric runs short, courage is the hem." Nora opened the tin now, running the measuring tape through her fingers as Jamie kicked his football gently around the open floor space. Over the years, the factory had changed with the times. The big orders dried up as manufacturing moved overseas. The rows of women dwindled to just Nora and occasional helpers. But she had kept it alive by taking in odd jobs, hemming school uniforms, mending work jackets for the lads from the estate, stitching curtains for Mrs. Patel above the newsagents. The place made sounds like rain on iron, snick of scissors, foot treadle sighs, kettle hissing. "You think they'll really knock it down?" Jamie asked, stopping his ball with the inside of his foot. In the fading afternoon light, dust motes danced around him like tiny stars. "They'll convert it," Nora corrected, though the distinction felt meaningless. "Luxury flats, most likely. That's what they've done with the old mill on Chapel Street." "But where will you work?" The question hung in the air like the last note of a song. Nora had asked herself the same thing 100 times since the developers first circled. At 42, with no qualifications beyond what her hands knew, the prospects weren't bright. "I'll find something," she said, with more confidence than she felt. "Maybe I'll finally take that bookkeeping course at the community college." Jamie, 14 and all elbows, leaned against a cabinet. He spent afternoons kicking his football against the back wall when he wasn't helping, counting the hollow echo between thuds. He'd bring Nora tea strong enough to stand a spoon in and say, "We'll make it, Mum." In the low winter light, he looked like the best bit of her stitched back together. "I could get a paper round," he offered. "Billy's brother does one, says it's easy money." Nora's throat tightened. "You focus on school, love. That's your job." They had little prepaid electricity that blinked red by Thursday, a secondhand heater that coughed more than it warmed, and bread that went hard too soon. But Nora believed, stubborn as the brick under her palms, that life could tilt in your favor if you held on long enough. She kept the factory's lights on for widows who still brought buttons in jam jars, for girls from the college who wanted to learn a straight seam, for the memory of the women who had marched to keep the looms turning when the owners threatened closures in the 70s. Faith was thin sometimes, like thread about to snap, yet it held. It had to. Jamie retrieved his ball and tucked it under his arm. "I'm hungry," he announced, the resilience of youth allowing him to pivot from crisis to immediate need without pause. "Can we get chips on the way home?" Nora checked her purse. £3.50 and some copper coins nestled in the worn leather. Enough for a small portion to share if they were careful. "Just this once," she agreed, though it was the third "just this once" that week. She switched off the lights, locked the cabinets where the more expensive fabrics were stored, and checked that the old iron was unplugged, a ritual as familiar as breathing. Outside, the street was waking to evening. The Chippy's fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow on the wet pavement. Mr. Doyle, red-faced and sweating above his fryer, gave Jamie an extra scoop of chips for growing bones. They ate as they walked home to their small flat above the laundrette, the salt and vinegar sharp, on their tongues the paper wrapping warm between their cold fingers. Their flat was one bedroom, Jamie had it, while Nora slept on the fold-out sofa in the living room. The walls were thin enough to hear Mrs. Greaves' television next door, the volume turned high to combat her failing hearing. The place smelled of laundry soap from below and the rosemary plant Nora kept on the windowsill. "For remembrance," her mother would have said. Jamie disappeared into his room to do homework, though Nora suspected he was more likely texting friends or playing games on the second-hand phone she'd scraped together money for last Christmas. She unfolded her bed and sat on its edge, finally allowing herself the luxury of uncertainty. The factory was more than a workplace. It was the last connection to her mother, to a lineage of women who had found dignity in the work of their hands. Without it, who was she? Just another middle-aged woman with limited options, a statistic in council reports about economic transition. She pulled out a small notebook from her bag and began to list possibilities. Seamstress work from home? The competition from online services was fierce. Teaching sewing classes? She'd need space for that. Working retail at one of the big clothing chains in the mall? The thought of standing under fluorescent lights, folding cheap clothes made in distant factories by underpaid hands made her stomach clench. The radiator pinged as it heated, a comforting domestic sound. Nora traced the cracks in the ceiling with her eyes, finding patterns like constellations. When sleep finally came, she dreamed of her mother's hands guiding fabric through a machine, creating something beautiful from nothing but thread and faith. Morning arrived with the rumble of the launderette's first cycle. Nora made toast and tea, laid out Jamie's uniform, and checked he had everything for school before he thundered down the stairs, late as usual despite her efforts. "I'll come by after," he called over his shoulder. "We can start packing stuff up if you want." Packing up. The words settled like stones in her stomach. She hadn't accepted that reality yet, wasn't ready to dismantle the world her mother had built. The walk to the factory took 12 minutes, past the newsagents, where Mrs. Patel was already arranging magazines, past the bus stop where the same faces waited every day, past the corner where the old pub had become an artisanal coffee shop, charging prices that made Nora wince. The factory door stuck in damp weather, requiring a firm shoulder. Inside, the space felt different today, as if it too sensed its impending transformation. Nora switched on the lights, filled the kettle, and laid out the day's work. A pair of curtains to hem, a jacket with a torn lining, a dress to take in. She worked steadily, losing herself in the rhythm of needle and thread. This was what she knew, what her hands understood without conscious thought. There was a rightness to it, a satisfaction in solving the small puzzles of fit and drape. The bell above the door jingled at noon. Asha, Mrs. Patel's granddaughter, stepped in with a paper bag. "Nan sent these," she said, placing the bag on the cutting table. "Samosas, she said you'd forget to eat otherwise." The spicy aroma filled the room, making Nora realize she was indeed hungry. "Your grandmother is too good to me," she said, wiping her hands on a cloth before accepting the gift. Asha, 17 and sharp as a new pin, glanced at the notice still taped to the door. "Everyone's talking about it," she said. "It's not right what they're doing." "It's business," Nora replied, the words tasting bitter. "Nothing personal." "Feels personal, though, doesn't it?" Asha perched on a stool, watching Nora eat. "This place matters to people around here." Nora nodded, unable to speak around the sudden tightness in her throat. It did matter, but mattering wasn't enough in a world measured in profit margins and development potential. The week after the notice, the rain sharpened into needles that stung the skin. Someone had spray-painted relic across the loading door overnight, the metallic stink of fresh paint mixing with the old oil. Nora scrubbed at it with turpentine and a rag, but the ghost of the letters remained, a shadow of contempt on the peeling green paint. The bank's letter arrived on Tuesday morning, delivered to the factory rather than her flat. The envelope was crisp white, official, with a window that revealed her name in cold print. Nora opened it with scissors that had cut through wedding silk and funeral clothes alike. No extension, no bridge loan, no mercy. Without a miracle, she would lose the lease by month's end. She packed samples into cardboard boxes salvaged from the back of the newsagents, each one labeled in her neat handwriting. Fabrics by weight and type, buttons by color and size, patterns by decade. Her hands could stitch blind, could feel a flaw in cloth that eyes might miss, could measure without a tape. But now they trembled slightly as she folded her mother's old smock, still bearing traces of Maureen's lavender talc. Jamie arrived after football practice. Mud splashed up his shins, his hair damp with sweat and rain. He tried to lighten the air doing keepy-uppies on the dusty floor, the ball thudding like a second heart against the concrete. "They don't get it, Mum," he said, catching the ball under his foot. "This place matters to people." "It's not just a building," she nodded, her mouth too tight for words. The kettle clicked and clacked in the kitchenette. She forgot the milk and drank tea bitter as old grief. "Mr. Doyle at the Chippy said his nan used to work here during the war," Jamie continued, determined to fill the silence. "Said she made parachute silk. And Mrs. Greaves from next door told me she got her wedding dress made here in 1962. Cost her 2 weeks' wages, but she still has it in a box under her bed." Nora placed spools of thread into a tin, arranging them by shade. "Knowing its history won't save it, love," she said softly. "The world moves on." "But where will people go? When their clothes need fixing, or they want to learn to sew, or—" "They'll order new ones online," Nora interrupted, a rare edge to her voice. "Or watch YouTube tutorials. Or go to that new craft cafe in town where they charge 20 quid for a beginner's class and serve artisanal coffee." Jamie stared at her, hurt flashing across his face. Nora immediately regretted her tone. He was trying to help in his 14-year-old way, trying to make sense of a loss he could feel but not fully comprehend. "I'm sorry, love," she said, crossing to him and smoothing his damp hair. "I'm just tired." He leaned into her touch for a moment, still young enough to accept comfort from his mother. "It'll be all right," he said with the baseless confidence of youth. "Something will happen." That night, she sat alone after Jamie went home to revise at the kitchen table. The factory settled around her, beams creaking the way elders do when they stand, after sitting too long. The only light came from the lamp on her workbench, casting a warm circle in the vast darkness. She thought of her mother's hands, red, quick, sure, and the way Maureen had tucked notes in unexpected places. A prayer behind the clock, a shopping list under the sugar jar, a joke in the cuff of a new sleeve. "Keep your head and your hands busy," the notes always said without saying. A draft licked her ankles. The skylight above, its frame painted a stubborn, peeling blue, rattled in a gust of wind. Nora closed her eyes and breathed the place in. Soap, metal, rain. A memory nudged her. Maureen telling a young Nora to mind the hollow behind the wall where the light bends. Something said on a day of laughter she could almost hear. She opened her eyes. Jamie's football rolled across the floor, propelled by the draft, and stopped against the back wall with a soft, almost hollow thud. The echo felt different, as if the bricks were holding their breath. Thursday brought Edward Langford back, this time without Miss Rowe. He wore a different coat, camel hair that looked soft as a baby's blanket, and carried a slim leather portfolio. His shoes still clicked like fate on the concrete. "Miss Bennett," he greeted her, his voice professionally warm. "I thought I'd check in, see how the preparations are coming along." Nora stood by her workbench, scissors in hand, halfway through cutting a pattern for what might be the last dress she'd make in this space. "As you can see," she gestured to the half-packed boxes, "we're making progress." He nodded, glancing around with the practiced eye of someone measuring square footage. "I wanted to discuss the possibility of salvaging some of the original features," he said, opening his portfolio to reveal architectural drawings. The developers are keen to maintain a sense of the building's heritage. These beams, for instance, and perhaps the main doorway. Nora's laugh was short and without humor. "Heritage. That's what they call it when they hollow out a place and leave just the skin." Edward's smile tightened fractionally. "I understand this is difficult. Change always is. But we're not villains, Ms. Bennett. We're creating new homes, new opportunities. For people who can afford £300,000 for a one-bedroom flat," she replied, returning to her cutting. The fabric was dark blue wool, thick enough to last years. Mrs. O'Leary's son was getting married in December. She wanted a special dress for the occasion. "The market dictates—" "The market," Nora interrupted, looking up sharply. As if it's some force of nature instead of people making choices about what matters and what doesn't. A silence stretched between them, taut as new elastic. Edward closed his portfolio with a snap. "I didn't come to argue economics, Miss Bennett. I came to offer you something." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew an envelope. "A goodwill gesture. Compensation beyond the terms of your lease. To help with relocation." He placed the envelope on the cutting table. Nora didn't touch it, didn't look at it. "Thank you," she said, the words stiff as new denim. "I'll consider it." Edward lingered a moment longer, his gaze moving around the factory as if memorizing it. Or perhaps already seeing through its walls to the sleek apartments that would replace it. "For what it's worth," he said finally, "I do recognize what this place has meant to the community. Progress isn't always tidy." After he left, Nora stared at the envelope. The sum inside would ease the transition, would help her find a new space. Smaller, of course, and not on this street where rents had tripled in 5 years. It would be the sensible thing to accept it. She slipped the envelope into her pocket unopened. There would be time for sensible later. The afternoon brought a procession of familiar faces. Mrs. Patel came to collect her granddaughter's altered graduation dress, her eyes damp as she surveyed the half-empty space. "My Asha learned to thread a needle right there," she said, pointing to the corner where the smallest work table stood. "Now she's off to university." First in our family, old Mr. Jenkins from the bookshop brought a stack of cardboard boxes. "Thought you might need these," he said gruffly. "And this." He handed her a book, Women's Work in Wartime Manchester. "History should be remembered," he added, patting the book's cover before shuffling out. By closing time, Nora's pockets were heavy with small offerings. Mrs. Doyle's handwritten recipe for tea loaf, a lavender sachet from the chemist's wife, a handmade card from the primary school children who had visited on a field trip last spring. Small gestures, weightless against the machinery of progress, yet somehow more substantial than the envelope of cash. She locked up and walked home through light drizzle, the kind that soaks you slowly apologetically. The estate agent's window displayed glossy photos of the future, computer-generated images of what the factory would become. Loom House Apartments, the sign proclaimed. Heritage living in the heart of Ancoats. Her flat felt emptier than usual that night, though nothing had changed. Jamie sat at the kitchen table, textbooks spread around him, chewing on the end of a pencil as he frowned at his maths homework. "Will you still be able to do alterations and stuff from home?" he asked without looking up. "Once we've moved all your things out of the factory?" Nora filled the kettle, the familiar domestic sound grounding her. "Some things, yes, but not the bigger jobs. Not without the industrial machines." "Could you get one for here?" She smiled at his simplicity. "They're expensive, love. And they need space. And this place already feels like we're living in a shoebox." "We could put it in my room," he offered. "I don't mind." The kettle boiled, steam clouding the small kitchen window. "We'll sort something," she said, not wanting to dampen his problem-solving spirit. "Don't worry about it now. Focus on your homework." Later, when Jamie was asleep, Nora sat by the window with a mug of tea gone cold. The street below was quiet except for the occasional passing car, headlights sweeping across the ceiling like searchlights. The envelope from Edward Langford lay on the table, still sealed. She thought of all the women who had sat at machines in the factory, whose hands had shaped cloth into useful, beautiful things. Women who had raised children on the wages earned there, who had found community in shared work, who had passed skills from mother to daughter in an unbroken line until now. The factory was just a building, she knew this. Bricks and mortar, timber and glass. But it was also a vessel for something less tangible. A way of being in the world, of making and mending, of valuing work done slowly and well. Once gone, that spirit would be harder to resurrect than any structure. She opened the envelope finally. The check inside bore a sum that made her breath catch, more generous than she had anticipated. Enough to ease the way forward, perhaps even to rent a small shopfront elsewhere, though not in this neighborhood where prices had risen beyond reach. Pragmatism whispered that she should be grateful, that Edward Langford could have offered nothing beyond the bare legal requirement, that this was, in its way, a recognition of what was being lost. But as she stared at the figure, all she felt was the hollow echo of Jamie's ball against the factory wall, and her mother's voice, faint but persistent. "Mind the hollow behind the wall where the light bends." Saturday brought a thin, pale sun that smelled of wet stone and possibility. Jamie arrived early, a paper bag clutched in one hand, his football under his arm. The bag contained a sausage barm from Doyle's Cafe and a grin that could brighten a blackout. "Breakfast of champions," he announced, placing the warm sandwich on the workbench. "Dad said you're not eating properly." Nora raised an eyebrow. Jamie's father, Mark, had reappeared in their lives 2 years ago, sober and repentant. He lived in Salford now, seeing Jamie twice a month and offering opinions on Nora's welfare that she hadn't asked for. Still, the sandwich smelled good, salty and rich in the cool morning air. Your dad worries too much, she said, but took a bite anyway. The bread was fresh, the sausage still hot. Simple food that tasted of home. Jamie wandered the factory floor, taking in the half-packed boxes and the machines draped in dust sheets like sleeping giants. He kicked his ball gently, following it as it rolled across the uneven concrete. Listen, he said suddenly, mouth half full of his own sandwich. He toe-tapped the ball toward the back wall. It hit with a thud. Then a pocket of echo followed, warmer than the rest, like sound falling into a fold of fabric. Nora glanced up from her breakfast. What? Jamie retrieved the ball and kicked it again, aiming for the same spot. The same odd echo replied. That, he said triumphantly. It sounds different there. Hollow. Setting aside her food, Nora joined him at the back wall. This section was older than the rest, part of the original structure from the 1880s when the building had been a small textile mill. The bricks were handmade, irregular, worn smooth in places by generations of backs leaning against them during tea breaks. Jamie rapped the brickwork with his knuckles, moving along until the note changed. Here, he said, eyes shining with discovery. A faint hairline crack zigzagged through a patch where the paint had bubbled and peeled, revealing the original clay beneath. All old buildings have quirks, Nora said, but she was curious now too. She ran her fingertips over the area Jamie had identified. The bricks felt different here, not just in texture but in temperature, slightly warmer than the surrounding wall, as if hiding a secret. Jamie fetched the old butter knife from the kitchenette, the one with the wobbly handle that Nora kept meaning to replace. He worked it gently under a loose brick, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. Dust rose in a tired sigh as the brick shifted. Jamie, be careful, Nora cautioned. We don't want to damage the structure. But it was too late. The brick came free in his hands, revealing a small cavity behind. Another brick followed, less firmly seated than it appeared. Behind it lay a small recess lined with newspaper clippings, edges brown and soft as toast, dates from the late 1970s visible in faded print. Mum, look! Jamie's voice cracked with excitement. He reached carefully into the cavity and drew out an envelope sealed with a flake of red wax, the seal still intact after decades. Beside it lay a folded letter tied with blue thread that had once been vivid but had faded to the color of a winter sky. The paper smelled of lavender and old rain, a scent that yanked Nora back to childhood so strongly she nearly gasped. Her name, Nora Bennett, was written on the envelope in a hand she knew better than her own. Her mother's writing, the loops and whirls as familiar as her face. It's from Grandma, Jamie whispered, suddenly solemn. He handed her the envelope with the reverence of an altar boy passing a sacred object. Nora's fingers trembled. She traced the writing, feeling the slight indentations where the pen had pressed. Maureen had been gone for 7 years now, taken by the cancer that had hollowed her from within, but never dimmed the light in her eyes. She left this for me, Nora murmured. All this time. She slid her thumb under the seal, which surrendered with a soft crack. Inside was a letter written on the same blue paper as the factory receipts Maureen had always insisted on using. Because people respect a proper invoice. Nora unfolded it, heart pounding against her ribs like a bird seeking escape. Maureen's words leapt from the page in faded blue ink. My dearest Nora, if you're reading this, it means the factory is under threat. I've hidden this letter where I know only someone who loves the place as we do would find it. What you hold now is your heritage and your right. In 1979, when the mill was set to close, we women fought not just for our jobs, but for what this place means to Encoats. Harold Bennett, no relation to us despite the shared name, was the last owner, a man with more conscience than his shareholders. He made a promise to us, the seamstresses who kept his books in the black when times were lean. A covenant lodged with the council, granting the building as a community workshop at a peppercorn rent so long as a Bennett served as caretaker for women in need. I became that caretaker, and now you after me. The covenant is legal and binding. The registry number is WK7729B, and it was stamped by Mrs. Rowe's predecessor, Malcolm Cartwright. I've included a copy, but the original is in the council archives. If anyone forgets, remind them. We built this with thread stronger than stone. All my love, Mum. Accompanying the letter was a folded document, its creases deep from years of confinement. Nora opened it with hands that had steadied now, driven by a growing sense of purpose. It was indeed a covenant, drawn up in legal language that swam before her eyes, but with key phrases that stood out clearly. In perpetuity, community benefit, textile arts, and Bennett caretaker. Jamie had been reading over her shoulder, his breath warm against her cheek. "Mum," he said, voice hushed with awe. "Does this mean they can't take the factory?" Nora pressed the paper to her chest. Heat moved through her, like the first gulp of tea after a long walk in the rain. "It might," she said carefully, not wanting to kindle hope too brightly before she was sure. "It just might." Jamie whooped, the sound bouncing off beams and pipes. "I knew it! I knew there had to be something." He punched the air, nearly dancing with excitement. "We've got to tell them, Ms. Rowe and that Edward bloke. We've got to show them they can't just bulldoze everything for their fancy flats." His jubilation was infectious. Nora found herself smiling, then laughing, the sound strange in a space that had known only her quiet determination for weeks. For the first time in months, the factory smelled not just of oil and dust, but of possibility. "We need to verify this first," she said, practical even in her mounting excitement. "Check that the covenant is still valid, that it's in the records." "How do we do that?" Nora carefully refolded the documents, sliding them back into the envelope. "We go to the council offices. If my mother said it's there, it's there. She never made promises she couldn't keep." Outside, the pale sun had strengthened, burning through the morning mist to cast sharp shadows across Ancoats. The old neighborhood was changing rapidly, craft breweries and design studios replacing family businesses that had operated for generations. But beneath the surface transformations, the bones of the place remained. The canals that had carried cotton and coal, the cobbled courtyards where children had played for centuries, the rhythm of life that flowed like an underground stream, unseen but vital. They locked the factory behind them, the key heavy in Nora's pocket. The envelope from Maureen was tucked safely in her bag, a talisman against despair. Together they walked toward the bus stop, their steps lighter than they had been in weeks. On the bus into town, Jamie gazed out the window at the passing city, his reflection overlaid on the Manchester streets. "Grandma was clever, wasn't she?" he said softly. "Hiding it like that all these years, just in case." Nora nodded. She always saw further ahead than most. Said it came from years of measuring twice and cutting once. "Do you think Miss Rowe will remember the covenant? Or that Edward?" "I doubt it. It was a long time ago. And people like Edward Langford only see the future, never the past." Nora's hand rested protectively on her bag. "But that doesn't make it any less real?" The council offices occupied a Victorian building on Albert Square, its facade blackened by decades of industrial smoke before the Clean Air Act. Inside, the entrance hall smelled of floor polish and damp coats, the high ceilings trapping echoes of footsteps and murmured conversations. At the reception desk, a young woman with elaborate braids and a nose ring directed them to the archives department on the third floor. "You'll want Jeff," she said, handing them visitor badges. "He knows where everything is, even the stuff they thought they lost in the flood of '98. Jeff proved to be a slight man with wire-rimmed glasses and cardigan sleeves that stretched over his knobby wrists. His eyes lit up at the mention of a 1979 covenant. "The WK series," he said, nodding appreciatively. "Those would be in the annex. Not digitized yet, I'm afraid. Give me 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes stretch like taffy." Nora and Jamie sat side by side on institutional chairs in the waiting area, not speaking, both aware that the next chapter of their lives hinged on what Jeff might or might not find in the dusty archives. When he returned, he carried a large ledger bound in green cloth, its corners frayed with use. Registration WK7729B, he announced, setting the book on the counter and turning to a marked page. Bennett Factory Covenant, executed October 1979. He tapped a yellowed document attached to the page. Still in force as far as I can see. Never rescinded or amended. Nora leaned forward, heart hammering. There it was, in black and white, just as her mother had said. A legal promise that the factory would remain a community resource for textile arts, maintained at a nominal rent, with a Bennett as caretaker. Would this prevent a development? She asked, hardly daring to breathe. Jeff adjusted his glasses. I'm not a solicitor, but covenants like this are binding on all future owners unless formally discharged. If it hasn't been, well, any developer would need to address it before proceeding. Jamie gripped Nora's arm, his fingers digging in with excitement. She covered his hand with her own, feeling the warmth of his skin, the quick pulse beneath. We'd like a certified copy, please, she said, her voice steady now, strengthened by certainty. And the name of someone in planning who might be familiar with this type of situation. As Jeff busied himself with the photocopier, Jamie leaned close to Nora. Mom, he whispered, we're going to win, aren't we? She looked at her son, this boy who had her eyes and her mother's determined chin, who believed in fairness with the unshakable conviction of youth. I don't know if it's about winning, she said softly, but it's definitely about not giving up without a fight. On the night of the council hearing, rain fell in silver sheets, turning Manchester streets into mirrors that doubled the yellow glow of street lamps. Nora dressed with care in her best outfit, a navy skirt suit she'd made herself for job interviews that rarely materialized, and a cream blouse with mother-of-pearl buttons, salvaged from one of Maureen's old garments. She pinned her hair back, applied a touch of lipstick, and slipped her mother's measuring tape into her pocket like a talisman. Jamie insisted on wearing a tie, though the knot sat crookedly no matter how many times he adjusted it. Gotta look proper, he said, straightening his shoulders. Like we mean business. They walked to the town hall together under a shared umbrella, their footsteps keeping time with the drumming of rain on the taut fabric. The Grand Victorian building loomed ahead, its clock tower, illuminated against the night sky, minute hand clicking toward the appointed hour. The chambers were bright and too warm, smelling of polish and wet coats. People packed the chairs more than Nora had expected. Mrs. Patel from the newsagents sat with her granddaughter Asha, clutching a library book on textile history. Mr. Doyle from the Chippy, the vinegar scent pleasantly lurking around him, had saved them seats in the front row. Students with tote bags bearing university logos murmured among themselves. Old machinists who had worked alongside Maureen decades ago nodded at Nora, their hands like maps with every road and river marked in blue veins. Edward Langford sat 3 rows up, impeccable in a charcoal suit, the silver of his cufflinks catching the light like ice. His expression was neutral, professional, though a slight furrow between his brows suggested concern. Ms. Rowe shuffled papers at a side table, her professional calm masking a flicker of curiosity as she glanced toward Nora. Quite a turnout, Jamie whispered, scanning the room with widening eyes. Did you tell everyone to come? Nora shook her head. Word travels, she murmured. The factory might be fading, but the community woven around it was still strong, threads connecting people across generations and backgrounds. Councillor Williams, a man with a face like a comfortable old sofa, called the meeting to order. We're here to discuss the proposed redevelopment of the property at 17 Jersey Street, currently known as Bennett's Factory, he announced, his voice filling the high-ceilinged room. I understand there have been some complications regarding the planning permission. Ms. Rowe stood, straightening her blazer. Yes, Councillor. An issue has arisen regarding a possible covenant on the property. Ms. Bennett has requested this hearing to present evidence. All eyes turned to Nora. The room quieted until even the heating pipes seemed to be listening. She rose, the recovered letter and registry copy in a clear plastic sleeve, fingers pressing it flat against the nervousness fluttering in her stomach. "Thank you for hearing me," she began. Her voice, when it came, was steady, the way steady sounds when it has trembled all it can and found solid ground at last. "This factory has stood in Ancoats for over a century. For the last 40 years, it has operated as a community resource for textile arts, providing training, employment, and services to local residents." She told them the names of women who had stitched through winters when the heating failed, spoke of babies rocked in laundry baskets under tables while their mothers worked, of burns from steam irons healed with aloe grown on windowsills, of laughter that outsang the noise of the machines. In 1979, when the textile industry was collapsing and mills across Manchester were closing, the owner of this building, Harold Bennett, made a promise to the women who had kept his business alive through difficult times. Nora held up the covenant. He established a legal agreement that the building would continue to serve as a workshop for the community, maintained at a peppercorn rent, with a Bennett, any Bennett not necessarily related to him, serving as caretaker. She read Maureen's words aloud, her mother's voice seeming to echo in the chamber. "We built this with thread stronger than stone." A murmur rose from the assembled residents. Ms. Rowe approached, requesting to examine the document. She studied it, lips moving slightly as she read, then looked up with an expression Nora couldn't quite interpret. "Registry number WK7729B, Ms. Rowe confirmed, turning to Counselor Williams. "This matches our records. We've located the original in the archives along with the subsequent rate agreements that reference the covenant." The counselor frowned, clearly weighing the implications. "And this covenant was never discharged or modified?" "No, sir," Ms. Rowe replied. "It appears to have been overlooked during the preliminary assessments for the current development application." Edward Langford cleared his throat and stood. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the document. Ms. Rowe handed it to him and he scanned it quickly, the set of his jaw tightening as he read. "I wasn't aware of any covenant," he said. Not slick now, but smaller somehow. A man finding the ground shifting beneath his certainties. "If it stands, I have no grounds to proceed with the current development plan." A ripple of whispers crossed the room. Jamie grabbed Nora's hand under the table, squeezing so hard it hurt and felt perfect. "The covenant is clear," Counselor Williams stated, after examining the papers himself. "The property at 17 Jersey Street is designated for community use, specifically for textile arts education and production, with a Bennett as caretaker." He looked directly at Nora. "You are that Bennett?" "I am," she confirmed, her voice stronger now. "My mother, Maureen Bennett, was caretaker before me. I've maintained the workshop for 14 years, providing services to the community and training to anyone who wanted to learn." Asha raised her hand, then stood without waiting to be acknowledged. "Ms. Bennett taught me to sew when I was 12, she said, her voice clear in the hushed room. "I made my own graduation dress with her help. Now I'm studying textile design at university." Others began to speak. Mrs. Greaves about the wedding outfit Nora had altered for her grandson's ceremony. Mr. Khaled about the curtains made for his restaurant when he couldn't afford commercial prices. A young woman from the community college about the free workshops Nora had run for single mothers learning job skills. Nora turned toward Edward, not with triumph, but with a dignity that warmed the room. "Stories are the ledger," she said quietly, "but tonight you can see the ink." The old machinist nodded, cheeks shining with unshed tears. One of them, Betty, Morris, who had worked beside Maureen for 20 years, called out, "It's not just a building, love. It's a promise kept." Applause grew, not wild but deep, like rain finding thirsty earth. In that sound, Nora's weeks of humiliation dissolved like sugar in hot tea. Edward, cheeks colored with what might have been embarrassment or something more complex, dipped his head in acknowledgement. Given the evidence presented, Councilor Williams announced. The planning application for residential development of 17 Jersey Street cannot proceed without addressing the covenant. The current proposal is therefore declined. More applause, louder now. Jamie whooped, then covered his mouth, eyes dancing with delight. Nora sat very still, the victory washing over her in waves, too big to absorb all at once. Edward Langford approached her as the meeting broke up, his professional mask back in place but with cracks showing around the edges. Ms. Bennett, he said, extending his hand, it seems I owe you an apology. I should have conducted more thorough due diligence. Nora accepted his handshake, his palm cool and dry against hers. It's easy to miss what you're not looking for, she replied without rancor. He nodded, acknowledging the gentle rebuke. The development company will need to reassess, but... He hesitated, a calculation visible behind his eyes. There might be room for compromise. The building needs significant repairs. Perhaps we could discuss a partial development that preserves the workshop space while adding residential units above or alongside. It was a concession, an olive branch extended in the language of business rather than community. Nora didn't answer immediately, aware of Jamie watching the exchange with narrowed eyes of the neighbors and friends lingering nearby, catching fragments of the conversation. Any discussion would need to include the community this place serves, she said finally. It's not just my decision to make. Something like respect flickered across Edward's face. Of course. We can arrange a proper consultation. My card. He slipped a glossy business card into her hand. When you're ready to talk possibilities. As he walked away, shoes no longer clicking quite so confidently on the polished floor, Mrs. Patel approached, her small hand patting Nora's arm. Your mother would be proud, Beta, she said, the endearment warming Nora from within. She always said you had steel in your spine. The room gradually emptied, conversation spilling out into the rainy night. Umbrellas blossoming like dark flowers on the steps of the town hall. Nora and Jamie were among the last to leave, gathering papers, accepting congratulations, promising updates to those who asked what would happen next. I can't believe we did it, Jamie said as they stepped out into the rain, which had gentled to a misty drizzle. We actually stopped them. Nora smiled, looping her arm through his. He was tall enough now that she had to reach up slightly to do it, a realization that caught in her throat. We didn't stop anything, love. We just made sure the right people were heard. They walked home through streets washed clean, past buildings old and new that told Manchester's story, cotton and coal, struggle and survival, reinvention and resilience. The city had endured because it knew how to hold on to what mattered while embracing change. A lesson Nora was only beginning to understand in her own life. What happens now? Jamie asked as they neared their flat. The windows of the laundrette below dark at this hour, the machines finally silent. Nora considered the question, turning it over like fabric to examine the weave. Now we plan. The factory needs work. Edward was right about that. We need funding, partnerships, a proper business model. The ideas were already forming, possibilities she'd never allowed herself to consider when survival was the only goal. Could be brilliant, couldn't it? Jamie's face was alight with possibilities. Proper classes, maybe selling stuff people make, getting some of those fancy machines they have at Asha's university. Nora squeezed his arm, his enthusiasm infectious. One step at a time, love. First, we need to make sure the roof doesn't leak, and the heating works through winter. At home, they made cocoa and sat at the kitchen table, the victory settling around them like a comfortable garment. The rain tapped gently at the windows, a rhythm as soothing as the treadle of a sewing machine. I keep thinking about Grandma, Jamie said, his hands wrapped around his mug. How she knew someday this might happen. How she left that letter just waiting for us to find it. Nora nodded, understanding flowing through her like warm honey. She always said life runs in cycles, like the seasons. That you have to prepare in summer for what you'll need in winter. Wish I could have known her better, Jamie murmured. I barely remember her, just bits and pieces. She's in you, Nora told him softly. The way you found that hollow in the wall? Pure Maureen Bennett. She could always sense when something wasn't quite right with a piece of fabric, could find the flaw by touch alone. They sat in comfortable silence, the day's events settling like dust after a storm. Justice, simple and public, had arrived without shouting, without drama. Just the quiet revelation of truth, long buried but never forgotten. It filled the small kitchen like light. That night, Nora dreamed of the factory as it could be. Windows clean and gleaming, machines humming, new voices mingling with echoes of the past. In the dream, Maureen stood by the blue-framed skylight, nodding in approval. Her measuring tape looped around her neck like a badge of office. You did well, Dream Maureen said, her Scottish burr thick with pride. You kept faith. Nora woke with the first gray light of dawn, the dream clinging to her like the scent of lavender. For the first time in months, she felt not just relief but anticipation, a hunger for the day ahead and all the days that would follow. The factory would stand, the work would continue, the promise would be kept. She made tea and toast, setting out Jamie's uniform by habit, though he was old enough now to manage without her fussing. When he emerged, sleepy-eyed but smiling, she saw in him the future of what they had fought to preserve. Not just a building or a business, but a way of valuing work done with care, of honoring the hands that made and mended. Ready for school? She asked, buttering his toast the way he liked it, with the butter reaching all the corners. Ready for everything, he replied, and in that moment, so was she. Spring crept into Ancoats with scaffolds wrapped in wisteria and kettle steam humming like a low song. The factory Bennett's loom house, folks had begun to call it, breathed again. Sunlight poured through cleaned skylights, catching dust motes that danced in the warm air. The smell of lemon oil and fresh pine mingled with the familiar undertones of fabric and metal that had permeated the bricks for generations. 3 months had passed since the council hearing. 3 months of negotiations, planning applications, grant writing, and community meetings held around the old cutting table, where residents brought biscuits and opinions in equal measure. The building still stood, but it was changing, not into luxury flats, but into something new yet familiar, like a well-loved garment remade with care. Warm bulbs glowed above new cutting tables built by Mr. Jenkins's nephew, who charged only for materials and brought his apprentice to help install them. The floor gleamed, old concrete polished to reveal aggregate that sparkled in the light. Along the back wall where Jamie had discovered Maureen's hidden letter, a mural was taking shape. Silhouettes of women at work through the decades, their forms outlined in thread rather than paint, created by Asha and her university classmates as their final project. Teenagers, Asha among them when she wasn't at university, learned to mend jackets instead of binning them. The air pricked with laughter and the soft burr of machines set right by a retired engineer who refused payment but accepted endless cups of tea. On Saturdays, a slow cooker in the expanded kitchenette released the comfort of stew or curry, depending on who was cooking. And old machinists told stories between spoonfuls, their voices blending with the sounds of a space alive with purpose. Nora moved through the rooms with sleeves rolled, checking tension on a new industrial machine, threading bobbins, greeting newcomers by name. Her hair was pulled back in a practical knot, a pencil stuck through it for safekeeping. She looked tired but lit from within, as if something long dormant had awakened. The adult education people called, Jamie announced, coming through the side door with his school bag still slung over one shoulder. At 15, he seemed to grow taller weekly, his school trousers already showing too much ankle. They want to know if you can fit in another beginner's class on Thursdays. The waiting list's getting long. Nora checked her ledger, a proper leather-bound book now rather than scattered notes. If we move the repair clinic to the morning, we might manage it. What do you think? Jamie grinned, pleased to be consulted. The pensioners who come for repairs prefer mornings anyway, less crowded on the buses. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Edward Langford, who now visited regularly to check on the renovations his company had agreed to fund as part of the compromise reached after weeks of negotiation. The development would proceed, but in modified form, the main factory space preserved for community use, with new residential units built on the adjacent lot and above the former loading bay, which had never been part of the original structure. Edward had changed subtly over the months. He wore the same expensive clothes, but his manner had softened around the edges. He nodded to Jamie, who acknowledged him with the cautious respect of someone not quite ready to forgive, but willing to move forward. "The council has approved the amended plans," Edward announced, setting his portfolio on the nearest table. "We can begin the residential portion next month. The contractors will work around your schedule as much as possible." Nora wiped her hands on a cloth tucked into her waistband. "And the accessibility modifications for this space?" "All included," he confirmed. "Ramp at the side entrance, wider doorways for the washrooms, everything to code." He glanced around, taking in the transformation already underway. "It's coming along well." It was a peace offering of sorts, this acknowledgement. Nora accepted it with a nod. The community has pulled together. People care about this place. Edward's gaze lingered on the mural on the women's forms frozen in eternal industry. "I see that now," he said quietly. "I wish I'd seen it sooner." The council had honored the covenant and added a small grant from a heritage fund for the renovations. Edward's firm, perhaps sensing both opportunity and obligation, had contributed significantly to the upgrades. "For the good this place clearly does," as he'd written in the accompanying letter. There was no parade, no ceremony marking this truce, only a handshake in the doorway one rainy afternoon that smelled of possibility and tea. "Will you stay for the workshop?" Nora asked, gesturing toward the circle of chairs being arranged by Mrs. Patel for the weekly mending clinic. "See what we actually do here?" Edward checked his watch, hesitated, then nodded. "For a little while." "I'd like that." He sat somewhat stiffly among the elderly residents who brought torn jumpers and frayed shirt collars, watching as Nora demonstrated simple repairs with patience and humor. By the second hour, he had rolled up his sleeves and was attempting to sew a button under the guidance of Mrs. Greaves, who corrected his technique with the firm kindness of a woman who had raised 5 children and had no time for fumbling. "Not so complicated once you know how, is it?" she remarked, inspecting his work with a critical eye. "Useful skill for a bachelor." Edward laughed, a sound that surprised even him. "My mother would be shocked. She always said men who did women's work were peculiar." Mrs. Greaves snorted. "Your mother never had to mend her own clothes on a clerk's salary, I'll wager. Nothing peculiar about being self-sufficient." Later, as the afternoon light slanted golden through the windows, Jamie helped serve tea in mismatched mugs collected from charity shops. The workshop hummed with conversation and the soft clicks of scissors, the rustle of fabric, the metallic whisper of needles through cloth. Edward lingered after the others had gone, examining the plans for the community shop that would occupy the front portion of the building, selling items made by local crafters on a profit share basis. "This could work well with the new residents," he observed. "Built-in customer base." Nora nodded, gathering mugs onto a tray. "That's the idea." The boundary between the workshop and the wider community shouldn't be a wall but a door, always open. He helped her carry the dishes to the kitchenette, an unexpected gesture that made Jamie raise his eyebrows from where he was sweeping the floor. "You've created something remarkable here," Edward said as they rinsed mugs in the sink. "I've developed dozens of properties, but I've never seen one come alive quite like this." Nora handed him a tea towel. "Buildings are just shells. It's people who make them breathe." When he left, the sky was turning the deep blue of denim worn soft with age. Jamie lingered by the blue-framed skylight, newly sealed against drafts, the paint fresh and bright against the old timber. The setting sun poured honey through it, warming their faces as they stood side by side. "We didn't just keep a roof," he said. voice hushed as if in church. "We kept a promise, didn't we, Mum?" Nora brushed a curl from his forehead, her thumb smelling faintly of soap and thread. "We did, love. And we made room for other people's promises, too." A kettle clicked off somewhere in the kitchenette, and someone laughed in the next room. A clear, bell-bright sound that belonged to Asha, who had returned with takeaway for their dinner, a Friday tradition now that she was home from university for the summer. "Will they remember you?" Jamie asked suddenly, the question catching Nora off guard. "Years from now, when we're gone, will they remember that you saved this place?" She considered this, watching the light change on the wall where Maureen's letter had hidden for decades. "They'll remember that we cared," she said finally. "That's enough." The summer stretched ahead, full of possibilities. The community board they'd established would meet next week to discuss autumn classes. The Heritage Grant application for oral history recordings with the former machinist was due by month's end. Plans for a children's summer program needed finalizing. Life was unspooling like thread from a bobbin, not in a straight line, but in patterns too complex to discern while in the middle of creating them. Nora looked at the old clock, now right on time thanks to Mr. Doyle's brother who had a knack for fixing timepieces, and thought of Maureen's letter tucked safely by the new ledger. The factory thrummed around them, not loud, just sure, like a heart beating in a healthy body. Outside, rain began again, soft as a blessing on brick. Through the open window came the sounds of the changing neighborhood, construction on the far corner where a new cafe was opening, children calling to each other as they raced home for dinner, the rumble of buses carrying workers back from the city center. Ann Coates was transforming, as it had done many times before, but now the factory would remain a constant, an anchor in the tide of change. That night, after Jamie had gone to his friend's house for a sleepover, and Asha had returned to her grandmother's flat, Nora sat alone at her workbench. She was finishing a wedding dress for a young woman who worked at the bakery 2 streets over, the silk organza catching the light like frozen mist. Each stitch was precise, measured, an act of creation that connected her to every woman who had sat in this space before her. Her phone pinged with a message from Mark, Jamie's father, confirming he'd collect their son for football practice tomorrow. Another ping followed, a photo from Mrs. Patel of the jumper she'd completed with Nora's help, worn proudly by Mr. Patel, who smiled bashfully at the camera. A third message contained the draft poster for the summer program, designed by one of Asha's university friends for a small fee paid in home-cooked meals, and the promise of exhibition space in the autumn. Nora set the phone aside and returned to her stitching, the rhythm soothing as prayer. In the quiet, she could almost hear the ghost of the factory, the women who had labored here through war and peace, boom and bust, their conversations and laughter embedded in the walls like fossils in stone. She was part of that lineage now, a link in a chain stretching backward and forward in time. A memory surfaced, her mother teaching her to use the measuring tape, showing her how to account for seam allowances and shrinkage. "It's not the measuring that matters most," Maureen had said, her accent thickening as it always did when she was sharing wisdom. "It's understanding what you're measuring for." Nora understood now what the years had been teaching her, stitch by stitch, that communities, like garments, needed constant tending, that what seemed fragile, thread, fabric, human connection, could, with care, outlast what appeared solid. That beauty often resided in the repaired and mended, rather than the pristine and new. The silk whispered through her fingers as she worked, the dress taking shape like a dream made tangible. Outside, the city settled into night, street lamps casting pools of gold on wet pavement, neighbors calling goodnight to each other, doors closing against the darkness. Inside, Nora Bennett continued her work, surrounded by the evidence of promises kept and possibilities unfolding. And she understood, in a way that went beyond words, what her mother had always known. Love and dignity are treasures that no one can steal. Not developers with plans, not banks with deadlines, not time with its relentless forward motion. They remain, woven into the fabric of lives connected by more than chance, by choice and care, and the courage to fight for what matters. The dress would be finished by morning. The bride would cry when she saw it. The factory would open its doors to another day of creating and mending. And Nora would be there, thread in hand, continuing the work that was both her heritage and her gift to the future. Not grand or revolutionary, but necessary and good and true. In the quiet of the workshop, with rain falling gentle as mercy on the roof above, that seemed like enough. More than enough. Everything.